Okay, well, it is about 11:30 Central Time and 12:30 Eastern Time, and welcome all of you to the sixth in our eight-part series, Leadership at Lunchtime, Leading in Trying Times. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, please send them in chat to Erica and Adam, and they will ask those to our guest expert at the close of the content period. The intent is about 15 minutes of content. And then the rest of the time is up to you for Q&A. We have an official end time at a 30-minute window, but so far every one of the other sessions we've had has gone longer, and I'm certain that we can induce Amy to hang on for a little bit and to share more of her experience and wisdom with us. With that said, let me give an incredibly warm welcome to Dr. Amy Cathey. Amy is the Executive Director of Business Development in our Graduate and Executive Education Department here at the Haslam School of Business, College of Business. And I think most relevant to us is Amy is an expert in the field of marketing and communications. She has extensive background, not just in the scientific application, but also in the consulting side of the world. So with that said, we'll do very similar conversations that we've had in the past. I'll pose some questions to Amy and we'll give it to her. So good morning, Amy.
Hey, thanks so much, Mike, for having me. And thank you for that very kind introduction. I am excited to see many familiar faces and names out there today.
Well, it's less kind and more well-deserved. So we're really lucky to have you today. Let me kick off with kind of a big, broad umbrella of a question. And you know, this entire series is in and around kind of leading in trying times. So really focusing on the crisis, both on the economic and the healthcare side. And I guess one of the biggest questions that jumps out at all of us that are leading in these times is, why are communications from key leaders so important during these extended crises?
So that's a great question, Mike. And let me start off with a little bit of background about the way people think and process information. The academic term and the kind of psychological term is the architecture of cognition, the way people organize thoughts in their mind. So most of us on a daily basis, we go around with a set of expectations about what's going to happen. And decision making is relatively easy because it's layered on top of a set of expectations about how you might accomplish those things. So if you think about it in very simple terms, you assume that when you flip a light switch, it's going to come on. You assume that when you put your key in your car ignition, it's going to come on. Think of the day that doesn't happen. Your power's out and you flip the light switch anyway, even though you know the power's out, because you're struggling with that new set of expectations that this new information has created for you. It changes everything the day that your car won't start, because every decision that you have made, every assumption that you base those decisions on, suddenly get called into question. Even though I wouldn't call either of those things crises, you're off kilter. Your way that your mind is organized is not typical or normal. And so what that does in reality is slows down your ability to think, to process information, and to make decisions. And so at its most extreme case, it can cause people to even freeze. And so the reason for leadership in crisis to provide clear, consistent, constant communication is because it helps people, everyone, reset their expectations and build those sort of ideas around whatever a new normal might look like, so that they build that base and can create the ability to process information, make decisions. In today's world, it's a crazy time, because in a time of crisis, not only do you have to make decisions, you have to make some of the hardest decisions that you've ever made. And you've got to put you and your team in a mental framework to be well equipped to do that. So it's not just important, it's imperative for a leader to have that communication.
I really like that you've kind of blended into the psychology field as well. You know, the way the brain reacts, that fight, flight, or freeze. And what I'm hearing is that the leader plays a significant role in minimizing that subconscious reaction and turns it more to kind of a deliberate activity.
Absolutely. And the good part is it's actually also an opportunity as you get people to unfreeze. They are actually thinking in a different way and in sometimes a more open way than what you would be thinking about when your expectations have not been challenged, because your assumptions have been called into question. What your ideal circumstance would be as a leader is to create that base of expectation, but not so much control that you don't allow people the freedom to build new ideas, new behaviors, new assumptions under that type of circumstance.
Yeah, fantastic. And so let's riff on that just a little bit. So the fact is that folks have a type of physiological and psychological reaction to a crisis. An extended duration crisis means that we're actually under a lot more cognitive load. What are some of the ways that people process information here, which then kind of helps the leader figure out how should I communicate to them? And I heard a little bit of it in the intro and the big question.
Okay, so can I share my screen? I have to, for all the students and people who are wondering what life is like now in the Executive MBA program, it's a lot like a DL. And so I wanted that flavor to come out, but also I think it's helpful to kind of show a picture. And so if you think about business communication in general, this is an example of what a business decision-making process might look like. When we think about that set of expectations, we dress up, we smile and have a pleasant look on our face. We bring our reports and notes and computer as backup to show that we've really thought about this decision. We're reading people's faces and reading their body movements to try to understand how they're responding to our comments and our thoughts. And we have that set of cues and clues that we're able to use. What a business meeting actually looks like in today's world is more like this. And so people aren't dressed up. You can't see their computers, reports, how much they've thought about it. We're all smiling, but what does that mean? Does that mean my child is really right behind me needing lunch? Or does it mean that I'm happy about the decision that we're discussing? Our ability to really use especially nonverbal cues in today's environment has diminished considerably. And so whether you're a peer, a leader, whether you're communicating with customers, suppliers, it's really important to understand that our ability to process is limited in some parts by the tools in which that we communicate now. Even if you look at a retail situation, this is what we normally think about as a retail transaction. You look at the person at the restaurant or the store, they hand you the bag, you smile, you make eye contact. We understand what that means in terms of creating a customer experience. This is the situation that we're in right now. We don't have the ability to provide some of those clues. And so whether it's internal communication to your team or external communication to your customer base or a broader set of constituents, we are limited right now. And so it puts the onus on our verbal communication, our words and our language to do more than it has to do under a sort of more normal situation.
Fantastic. So let's talk just a little bit about kind of leaders in communication during these times. Very often they're going to have to provide difficult and very hard to hear information. How can we do this without destroying kind of morale and perhaps more importantly, finding the hope in the situation in front of us?
That's a great question. And it's one of the really challenges. What I would say in general is everything that we know about communication, the rules and the guidelines that you've learned since second grade about how to communicate well. Think about your audience, be honest, be consistent, be correct in what you say. All of those rules still apply. We have not changed the rules. We have changed the context. And so when you say, how do we deliver bad news in a way that continues to inspire or deliver, there's some basic tenets that we would use in any type of context that would apply here. Be honest. Respect your audience by reaching out and accommodating the fact and including the fact that they have brains too. In today's world, they're watching the news. Nothing is business as usual. So if you get up as a leader, as a peer, and say, hey, we've always done this in the past and this is what we're going to do again, you're not being respectful of your audience, whether it's an internal or an external group's ability to partner and process that information. The other part, as I indicated, it's more important. We have to rely on our verbal cues. We don't have as many nonverbal cues. And so the ability to be specific has never been more important. As we talked about, people are processing information at a less rapid rate of speed. They need, more than ever, a soundbite, something to hold on to, something that's very specific and actionable. If you ask most people right now, what's one thing I can do to keep from getting sick with COVID-19? They're going to say, wash your hands. That's a simple answer to a complex question. It's not intended to be a complete answer, but it is an answer that people can understand, they can take away, and they can act on. And so as a leader, being able to understand the nuances of a very complex situation and question, but simplify it in a way that people can bite onto, act, and sort of, if there was one thing, most of the people who are listening and in your audience want to help you. So if there's one thing that people who want to help you can do, what's the one thing that they can do? That's the framing for providing that kind of information, especially in a crisis situation like this one.
What I really love about you talking about this idea of honesty and transparency is actually quite important because those are foundational elements for trust, aren't they?
Absolutely.
And people are going to take on the communication. They have to be able to trust the leader, to have their best interests at heart, to have better perspective on the overall circumstance. And the other thing that you're talking about, this level of simplification, I think is absolutely vital. If you think about simplification, it's not being paternalistic or maternalistic. We're not dumbing things down. We're providing focus. So, I mean, that's a powerful message.
Absolutely. Not only focus, but you are providing your audience with a way to help. And I think that, and also a way to get more information if they need it. And I think that you're exactly right. You don't want to dumb things down or tell people what they want to hear. You want to provide access to a more complex answer, but you need to give them the simplest way to get started, to keep them engaged and to keep them moving forward.
Absolutely. So let me ask one more question for the content area. And it's a tricky one. There are always multiple channels of communication in the best of times. The leader says something, the coworkers say something. I think right now, they run rampant. And so in the absence of perfect insight, your next door neighbor is going to tell you something that they saw on a Reddit, thread that from some type of conspiracy, nut out there, and it's going to carry equal weight. So the water cooler, the virtual water cooler now, the gossip pipeline is in competition with the leadership. How should leaders address this as they communicate to kind of make certain that there's a stable basis for understanding?
That's a great question. And I'll even take it up a notch. I will tell you that what people hear off channel, they're going to find even more believable than what they hear on channel. So I won't even say they'll put equal weight on it. If it's a water cooler conversation about the conversations that might be happening in the back room, they're going to somehow assume that was heard for a reason and that there's something there. Again, part of it as a leader comes back to the fact that we are limited in much of our communication methodology right now by the clues that we can give. Our nonverbal cues are more limited via Zoom, more limited in a retail situation with social distancing. We don't have the basis for being able to provide the experience, whether it's an employee experience, a customer experience, we're learning and we're learning fast, but we don't have all the pieces in place. What we know though, in that limited situation, just like what a person, how believable they would find an off-channel communication, we know that in normal times and in abnormal times, people find the nonverbal cues more believable than your verbal cues. So if I am standing in front of you as a CEO and I say, I'm confident in our business future and my hands are shaking, I could be extremely confident in our business future and a bad speaker, but no one is going to believe I'm confident in our business future. They're going to say, hey, her hands were shaking. There's no way. She was lying. She was totally lying about that. Mm-hmm. And in this world, we don't have the same ways of holding, sort of doing that follow-up and check. You know, in a more traditional situation, you can go down the hall, visit someone later. You hear more of the talk. In our more distributed world, that is more difficult, and we are learning more new ways to do that. But especially as a leader, you're a little more isolated than you might be during more normal times. And so what can you kind of do about that as a leader? The first thing you can do is recognize it. Recognize it and sort of address it head on. This is the conversation that I've been privy to. These are the things that I'm thinking about, and here's how you can help. The second thing, I think, is being very consistent and specific in what you say. This is not the time to be having a conversation with one group and texting a different conversation to another group. You've got to lead by values and have a consistent message that goes out to all of the different groups that you're interacting with.
Yeah, and you know, you're touching upon impression management, which is not being false. It's leading by example, exhibiting calm demeanor, and that the nonverbals that you're talking about are quite important for military leaders in combat. And now it's very similar to the leaders we have in our organizations as we're facing this incredible crisis. And I think the last bit that you just started talking about really kind of resonates with me, which is we don't know everything. So we tell them what we know. We tell them what we don't know, and we tell them what we're doing to find out. You know, that's how you build trust and confidence. Well, let's turn it over to our audience, our participants, for their questions, and we'll have Erica and Adam kind of tag team that and ask them to you, if that's okay.
That's perfect. Thanks.
All right, great. Erica, Adam, over to you.
Hi, Amy. As a team member, what are some of the things you can do to improve communication within your team?
Hey, Erica, that is a great question. And I think that's one of the really best questions. Mike, nothing against you, but I think that's one of the best questions that I've had so far. You know, many more of us are team leaders than CEOs leading this charge right now. And within a team, you know, you hear in leadership, how do you lead from the chair as opposed to leading from the front of the room? And it has never been more important to lead from the chair. Help your person that's leading your organization, your meeting, whatever it is. What are the things that they are not able to see? In the same way that you are able to read cues as an audience member in a real room, you're able to read cues as a leader. You see if people are looking away. You see if people are texting on their phones. That's tougher to do in a distributed environment. You're not able to see that. And so as a team member, one of the best things you can do is help create that cohesive, supportive culture among members of your team and in support of the leadership groups that are working to try to bring your organization or your team through this really challenging time.
Thank you, Amy. I've got a question for you. What are some of the key communication challenges when using video conferencing or phone and you can't meet face-to-face?
I should probably ask you guys all that question, because I think all of us have been in those kinds of situations for the last month, and I think we've talked about some of those. recognizing that communication goes a little bit slower via video conference, recognizing that people are a little more distracted via video conference. And again, like we talked about with Mike, recognizing that we are without some of the cues that we normally use to read people's engagement and involvement. So it's an interesting thing. I will be really interested to see what the etiquette comes from and norms come from this sort of era of GoToMeeting and Zoom. Right now, it's kind of the wild, wild west. Like I showed in my slide, people don't dress up, they don't put on makeup, they sit back in their chair and relax during a meeting. They have their pets and kids on their lap, and we're all incredibly supportive of this because we're all learning and we're all going through this process. But as we go forward, in the same way that if someone came into you to interview for a position and they weren't wearing appropriate attire and they weren't sitting forward in their chair and they weren't fully engaged in the work that's being done, you would make certain assumptions about their ability to be productive in your workplace. Eventually, I think we're going to get to that point that in a more distributed environment, you've got to show how you can contribute. You've got to show where your passion is. You've got to show that you came prepared and ready, just the way you would come to a business meeting that wasn't in a distributed way. So I think those are challenges right now. I see us getting smarter fast, and I see us, and when I say us, I mean the whole world of business, not leaving this idea of telemeetings anytime soon. And as that happens, I think we're going to see a set of guidelines that come out. If you think about even something as relatively new as social media, when social media first started, it was kind of the wild, wild west. And people had all kinds of, there still are all kinds of stories about stuff that people posted on social media. We're seeing that out of Zoom meetings now. Here's what happened in a meeting that I was in. Here's what someone did. And we're going to see guidelines and help, I think, for closing some of that gap. But in the short term, Adam, what I can say is it is a little bit more of a challenge. Recognize it, be accommodating and kind to people on both sides of the camera that are learning how to work in this kind of an environment. And, in some ways, I think right now, one of the best things we can do is be kind. It's important in a normal business environment, but to be understanding and recognizing that the person on the other side of the camera, of the cash register, whatever it might be, you don't know all of the circumstances behind what's going on in their life, has never been more relevant than it is right now.
Thank you, Amy. So my next question is, given that chance meetings and communication is a powerful mode of leaders receiving information, which helps them have a strong situational awareness, how can we do this more deliberately with a dispersed workforce?
I think you used the perfect word, deliberate. It is true that we think of things as chance meetings, and we might run into someone in the hall and say, wow, I am so glad that I ran into you in the hall. But it's not really by chance that you are working in the same hall. At some point, organizationally, there was some method to the madness in terms of how people were organized and situated and structured. And I think in today's world, being deliberate, how do you create some informal channels of communication in addition to the formal channels of communication that are similar to what happens in the workplace? We see that a lot with places that do Zoom happy hours. Suddenly that's your spot where you take a small group of people that would gather around the water cooler or have lunch together at work, and you have lunch or have a drink or have a little bit of downtime in a way that is not that's purely social. And I think we need that social and informal feedback loops now more than ever. So I would encourage intentionality. Zoom into a meeting that you would just normally have as a conversation, if there's a peer, if there's a mentor that you have, never has there been a better time to say, hey, I'd love to do a 15-minute Zoom session just to kind of catch up, hear what's going on in your mind, talk about things. And as a leader, you've got to do that with whoever your sort of group intentionally is that you would find as decision makers and also as mentors as well. It's a great question.
Thanks, Amy. So my question is, how or what methods would you recommend using to communicate with a virus denier? And please don't say be patient.
Well, I will kind of come close and say be kind. People have so many different, I think we all have concerns under every condition, keeping the people around us safe, first of all, keeping them productive, keeping them happy. And so there's a difference between the virus denier that puts you in puts you or a member of your team in an unsafe situation. So if there's someone who's not following guidelines that are set by the health department, you have to go with our recommendations of this is what our country is asking us to do right now to keep everyone safe. It is a workplace, and even broader than that, it is a environmental governmental rule that we need to stay 6 feet apart. So those are easy to handle. If they are a virus denier and just loudly verbal about how they think this whole thing is crazy in the same way that people have political views that they express at the office place formally and informally all the time, you would handle it in that same way that you would work with somebody who is expressing maybe an unpopular or a little too verbal in their views, which is just to socially, let that person maybe talk with that person about what the impact is on the team, perhaps have share some information about the variety of views and the need to be inclusive, particularly in this environment. But I would say there's a need to be inclusive, particularly in this environment, which means we've got to include all of the perspectives and let that person in safe ways share their viewpoints in discussions.
Amy, so we're coming up on the 30-minute mark. Some people will start signing off,
Sure.
But they can come back later. We're going to keep the cameras rolling, basically, and they can come back and hear the remainder of the Q&A if you're okay to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Fantastic. All right. So I guess, Erica, are you up next?
Indeed. Hi, Amy. All right. So my next question is, how would you help your employees during employee meetings to stop waiting for the bad news? We are working super hard to provide vision, encouragement, and empathy with weekly corporate calls, meetings, updates, in addition to 2 daily stand-up meetings. I recently learned that folks here appreciate the meetings, but keep waiting for bad news. Is this our good communication versus the media chaos?
That's a great question. And so let's go back to the architecture of cognition, how people think and what they expect. And so what is the source of that expectation as a base level that would have a group thinking that the bad news is about to come? Is it, as Mike said, a lack of trust? Is it that they're watching too much media and they see evidence that our country is changing? Is it that they're getting feedback from within the organization that revenue is declining, or that other people are being laid off, or whatever the piece is? And so I think this is a great opportunity to do some informal communication channels to kind of understand what's going on, what is the talk behind the scenes. But it's also the opportunity within the formal communication channels to be consistent and open and transparent, and maybe address that. Hey, I've heard people saying they're waiting for the other shoe to drop. We don't know what this is going to happen. We're in good shape for the next X number of months. You know, if that's something that your leadership is able to say, go ahead and address it and put it out on the table. On the other hand, if you're not in good shape for the next X number of months, you're going to have to make decisions in the next 30 days. It would be better to upfront address that and say, we don't know what's going to happen, but we know that within 30 days, we're going to have to make some really hard decisions. And we're working through the criteria that we're going to base those decisions on. It sounds like there's a disconnect in that particular case between the formal and the internal and the informal channels. Mike, you may have some other thoughts on that one.
In honesty, one of the things we have to be careful of in crisis is painting too cheerful of a picture. And the fact that they're expecting bad news to come, we have to contextualize it all. And when we communicate is we're maybe not out of the woods yet, but there is hope for the future. And so I think that we have to inject, you know, as you said earlier, there's a positive kind of feeling that should be injected as well. And the whole concept of they're just waiting for the next shoe to drop is a frightening psychological principle. And we as leaders, for everything that you've said so far, our role is to not just calm the waters, but to chart the journey ahead for them. And realizing that all news is not going to be bad, all news is not going to be good, but that we're going to be clear and accurate in talking about how we're going to move forward. So thanks for tossing that to me. That's one of my favorite things, which is what our job is as a leader.
Absolutely. These are good questions. And I will say it is, we see a lot of examples right now of communication in this time. A lot of them cluster together. Actually, a lot of them have been very good than very bad. But very good, but not a differentiated communication can almost tune people out. So if you think about your own email box, as this was unfolding maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, I got emails, as we all did, from companies we didn't even know we were on their email list. And they all said, from their president, manager, CEO, thank you so much for your customer. We want you to know how clean we are keeping our operations, and we want you to know how important our employees are to us, and the same points over and over again. And they were very salient, important, valuable points, but it became undifferentiated communication. And you're kind of like, wow, I didn't know I was on their mailing list, versus, wow, that's an incredible leader. And so I think one of the challenges is to think about, how do you create a message that's unique to your organization, your team, your customer base? What is it that you have to offer that people want to be affiliated with as employees, as customers? And that has never been more important than in today's time. There's a really interesting book on leadership called Forged in Crisis that came out a couple of years ago. It was written by a historian at Harvard Business School. I think her name's Nancy Kuhn. And it goes through leaders, everyone from Rachel Carson to Abraham Lincoln. And it really asks the question, would they have the reputation that they have now if they hadn't led during a time of crisis? In other words, in some ways, the crisis is the opportunity that allowed them to step up and be someone really unique and contribute a lot of value to our society. And so I would just, I guess, encourage, as we are thinking about those kinds of things, how can you be a little different? How can you go a little bit farther, do a little bit more, not in just your communication, but in your activity to make a difference during this time? Sorry, I might have gotten on a soapbox there a little bit, Mike.
I'm on the soapbox with you, because I think that we also have to be quite cognizant of who we're talking to. And so I got the exact same emails you did, folks that I haven't done business with in years, and I felt it was a bit tone deaf. And it almost felt like they were opportunistic as a crisis, but without any justification. And that differentiation of messaging actually turned me off to a couple of those as well. So.
Yeah, I think some of the most successful ones, again, have been some of the most specific, and even a small business. I mean, we had an example of a small business here in Knoxville that was operating. It was a restaurant. They were operating in a, in an effort to keep paying their employees and keep them going, and there's a cost to operating. And so, one night they said, we've got to sell 17 more meals in order to be able to open tomorrow. Well, they sold a lot more than 17. That 17 sold out right then. But people resonated with the fact that, how can we help? What's the one thing that we can do, and how close are we? And we want to be on this journey with you. And it was a really important kind of pivotal moment for that management team, as well as that customer base, I think.
Amy, you talked a little bit about keeping the message simple and impactful as a takeaway to today's session. Any suggestions on how to manage a simple, impactful message when the message itself seems to evolve and change every day?
That's a good question. And I think being honest about that, and we saw that some over the last month. You saw leaders say, based on what we know now, what we know today, here's the best action step we can take, knowing that this might change. And so I think, again, being upfront and honest, but saying, hey, I've weighed everything I know right now, and this is the direction we want you to go. The interesting part about where we are now at the end of April, as opposed to where we were at the end of March, is even though we don't know exactly what might happen next month, we have a more confidence in the range of things that might happen. And so we, as a leader, as a team member, the expectation to have a set of contingency plans that address the range of known things that might happen is going way up. And I think you're going to see a much higher level of execution as we go forward than what we have seen over the last month. What we've seen over the last month has been nothing short. I mean, it's been a true crisis, and there have been some cases of panic, and you have seen that real time play out. And I think in general, people have recovered and have been very accommodating of those mistakes, because everyone realizes there was no way to predict this. Going forward, there's a little more opportunity to predict this, at least within some set of guardrails. And so our expectations as communicators, as leaders, is really going up from where it has been. And I think that's hopefully the benefit of sessions like today, to be able to think about those communications and create a more timely set of responses. And even for teams, even for customers, you need to start to provide, if you think about the financial markets and the stock markets, companies provide what they call forward-looking statements and guidance. They're not always right. Sometimes they're wrong, but we're at a point that as organizations, we can start to provide some, at least a range of options and forward-looking thoughts that are going to help our employees and our customers journey along with us a little bit better.
Hi, Amy. So this question is kind of tagging on to the past couple of questions being discussed. So you talked about having a consistent message with the ever-changing environment we are now exposed to. How do you address having a consistent but constantly changing message?
Okay, so let me give you this example. We've seen it in a lot of businesses. The consistent message is based around the higher level values. So if one of our values is we're going to keep our employees safe, as an example, we're going to keep our customers safe, we're going to keep our employees safe. There's no reason that should not be a consistent message, even if today being safe means wearing masks and tomorrow it means wearing gloves, and a different day it means taking them all off. The action step is going to change and update. The implementation is going to be based around our best knowledge and best practices of that day. But the values, and so I think especially higher in the organization, but even in small teams, if your team knows why you're making decisions, what are the values that you are using to weigh alternatives, they can predict what decisions you're going to make. And that clarity is very comforting to people. And so that's what I said, even if you're in a situation where you don't have the cash to last more than 30 days and you say, I'm in a tough spot and we're going to have to make some really hard decisions, but here are the values, here are the kinds of considerations that we're going to be taking into account. That is very comforting, even though the message is very hard to hear.
Amy, that's absolutely brilliant. So thank you for that. We're focusing so much on what's changed, but the crisis doesn't change who we are. And so by having that consistency and that baseline of our core values and what we share in beliefs as an institution, it makes the other messaging so much clearer and better received, I think. So thank you for that answer.
Absolutely.
Amy and Mike, where does levity fit in this crisis in remote communication?
That's a great question. And the answer is more than we see it. It's been a tough, it's really been a tough road. And just like every challenge, you've got to figure out what people need the most personal and internal level to make it through that challenge. And humor is some of that. And I think at least in the beginning, there was so much that was unknown. You would never want to be thought of as making a joke or making light of the situation. And so there was just an avoidance of really having fun during it. But I think now we're starting to see companies come out with theme songs. We're starting to see social hours. We're starting to see social media sites dedicated to all the hokey pictures and funny things that have happened to kind of turn the world upside down in this. And I think that's very welcome. Even in the media, I think we're seeing, obviously the media loves bad news more than good news. This is not limited to a crisis situation. It gets more attention. It gets more clicks if somebody has done something terrible than if somebody's done something good. But it really use it as an opportunity to laugh. Use it as an opportunity to find the silver lining. Enjoy family. Explore family opportunities that you didn't have before. I think we're turning the corner really, and maybe already have turned it a little bit to where there's some openness to having some of that discussion and fun. I haven't seen the virtual retreat yet that's equivalent to the ropes course, but I'm excited to see what that morphs into and looks like, because there are going to be some tools that contribute to team building in a social and personal way that come out of this and will help us through this.
That's great to hear, Amy. So I have another question for you. How do you balance communication tasks and workloads? Being reachable on phone, email, text, Zoom, and team chat seems to be a constant distraction. How can you still be available and yet have time to focus on your workload?
That is a great question, and I will tell you that is not different in April than it was in January. That is a constant battle to figure out how do you carve out time for what's important versus what is urgent. Now, it is true that some people's workloads have changed. And it is true that what's important and what's urgent have morphed in some cases. And so I understand where that question is coming from. But the answer, at least my answer, is a really sort of old school answer that would apply under any time, which is you've got to figure out what works for you. So if you need 2 hours a day of uninterrupted time to work, then maybe you get up early in the morning and from 6 to 8 o'clock or 7 to 9 or whatever, you build that into your schedule and you give yourself the 2 uninterrupted hours. Maybe later in the day, you give yourself 2 hours off to make up for the fact that for the early morning. But it's easier to have that productive time when it's truly silent and you're not keeping one eye on the phone or on other things. And so you've got to figure out whatever works for you. If you need Saturdays off, take Saturdays off and tell people that you're taking Saturdays off. That's not different under COVID-19. In fact, I think in general, people appreciate the boundaries that you put forward. As long as you're available, they know you're available and they know your response window. Your response window does not have to be 15 minutes.
Yeah, Amy, let me add, because leaders, one of their core functions is communication. So we can only influence through communicating, whether it's in writing, through discussion, or by setting an example. That's a method of communication. So this, you're exactly right. This doesn't change. What you said earlier is actually relevant. We have to be more deliberate and careful about it. Where we could do leadership by walking around before, now we have to do leadership by zooming around. And that's going to take a little more time. And so the disciplined time management that a leader has to employ, it's no different than what we did in January. We just have to be a little more cognizant of it right now and do it more on purpose. So thanks for that answer.
I've got kind of a related question here, but a recent article in the New York Times presented evidence that online sessions lead to fatigue and loss of concentration. Any tips? Should online sessions be shorter and more focused? And as a aside, not this session, but others.
I completely understand. No, I think we know that. We know that people process information more slowly when they take it in online. We know that it is easier to get distracted when you're online. We know that especially, and this is why a lot of people put cameras on versus cameras off, that, when your camera's off, you're multitasking. Most of us are multitasking when our camera's off. And so, whereas that's great because you can sit through 6 hours of meetings and still get some work done, which you can't do under the normal environment, you are straining your brain more than you are in the normal environment because you have two streams going consistently and you're not really able to fully focus and concentrate on either. And so as I do think we will see meetings adjust based on some of the things that we know about online processing of information. One of the things that we know about video teaching is that shorter sound bites are better. Even in a classroom, we know that in a 60-minute session, you get 10 minutes, maybe at most, of really thoughtful engagement. And then you have to give people a break before you re-engage in sharing information. Any of you have gone into a classroom or a meeting and you just hear someone go with a fire hose of new information for 60 minutes, you're overwhelmed. Via Zoom or via online, we see that same thing, but we haven't quite figured out how to put the mitigating factors in yet to soften that. And so I think we are going to see a move to shorter meetings or breaks in the meetings or something that allows people to re-engage and stay engaged. That's a really good question.
Hi, Amy. So I have a last question for you. We are entering performance review season. What guidance do you have for delivering a performance review virtually or in person, but with social distancing in place?
So I guess there's several aspects to that. One, in terms of performance reviews, my personal philosophy of performance reviews is there should be no surprises in a performance review. It is a way that you document conversations that have been had for a full year. And so with that as sort of a context, there are a couple of scenarios. One, if you really are documenting conversations that have been had for a year, being able to do it in a similar way that you do it in a work environment, which is to say, hey, great job. Here's some paperwork. Let's go over it. It documents our conversations for the year. There should be no surprises here. That's really very acceptably done via Zoom, via phone, via email. There's more personal attention is always better than less, but that's an easy conversation to have. If the performance review conversation is more difficult, if it includes some surprises, if it includes information that person is going to have to process, that they'll have questions about, I would encourage you, to the extent that it's possible, to do two things. More personal is better than less personal. So if you're in an environment and you can be in a situation where you can see the person and put social distancing in place, but have the physical conversation versus online, that would be advantageous. If you're not in that environment, at least do video versus phone. Certainly do phone versus email. Get as close as you possibly can. But the other thing I would suggest is break it into more than one communication, because this person's going to need to hear, they're going to need to process, they're going to need to ask questions. And so maybe it is a series of, I'd like to have an initial meeting to go over our process, and then then we'll start that process. Or maybe it's, we're going to have an initial meeting. I want to bring up this concern. I wanted to let you know that I'm thinking about this concern. I wanted you to think about this concern. And then I want us to get together in a more personal way and talk about this concern. Those would be suggestions that I would have to, try to mimic at least the processing of information that you would engage in a more typical year, so that someone's not having to deal with tough news and a difficult process at the same time. That's a really good question.
One of the things that I took from my old Army days is that the leaders actually had to submit what was called a support form during the appraisal system of, here's what I did, here's what didn't work during the year, here's what I want to work on next year. And so they had accountability as the person being appraised to appraise themselves. And it found the conversations went a lot better if they'd had the time to kind of think objectively about their year in review. And then it became a conversation as opposed to a one-way transmission of information.
That's a great suggestion.
Go
ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say, one thing that wasn't asked as a question, since Erica said that was the last question, and I'll just kind of share it as something I've been thinking about, maybe a piece of advice. Good communicators are going to be good communicators no matter what the method. All of you all are online because you want to do this better. And you're going to be a great communicator, whether you're in person, via Zoom, whatever. Some people are challenged or don't think about communications as a really important way of interacting with the people around them. Our distributed environment makes it easier to hide behind the environment and avoid communicating. So just like something like performance reviews, in a normal world, the good manager brings the person in, has a long conversation, goes through everything, and the person who doesn't prioritize that communication quite as much says, hey, come on in, here's some paperwork, let's sign it, let's leave. In a more distributed environment, you can see that person who's normally a little less communicative go 2 steps back. They may well just send it out by email. It's performance review time. Here's the paperwork, done. Or if it's a tough piece of information, hey, we're going to have to furlough 800 people. Hopefully someone in charge of 800 people would prioritize communication. But you see it in cases. Wow, I just had to get that news out. It was late breaking, and I wanted to get it out as fast as possible. And that's the language that you'll hear. And so I would just encourage you all, to the extent for both personally and within your network, to be thoughtful about that and not use this environment and the tools that we're leaning on right now to hide from doing what you know is the right thing about respecting your audience and communicating in a way that the other person and you deserve.
And Amy, one of the things that I think that's consistent upon all great leaders, and I'm not talking those that are in the paper, but those that make a difference, meaningful impact on people's lives, is that they are strong communicators. They're not all born to it, but this is luckily a skill that we can develop with practice and experience. So thank you so very much. And your graciousness giving of your time to this. I am absolutely certain that you've made a difference today through your communications, and I really appreciate it. So thanks so much for coming in and joining us, Amy.
Well, thanks for doing this seminar, and I will see you guys back next week. If I can do a quick promo for our next week, it really takes this week one step further, and not just how we communicate, but the opportunity in slowing people down in the way they're thinking to make positive culture changes within an organization. And we'll have Brian Bonomo, who is a well-respected. He started his own consulting firm in HR and culture after 25 years of serving in senior leadership roles in HR for a lot of companies, and excited to have him as a guest. He's a 2006 alum as well. So.
Thank you, Amy. I couldn't have said it better, and I appreciate that I don't have to end. So we'll see you all next week. And in the meantime, for the time in the middle, be safe, be healthy, and keep learning how to lead and serving your people as best you can. So thank you all so very much.
Awesome. Have a great day, everyone.